I see that folks are joining our webinar. Welcome to those of you joining. This is the webinar from the Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research, the RICMAR program on behavioral and social research and NIH clinical trial guidance. We will be starting in about 2 minutes. So I am available if you have any questions. You can either send a question through chat. Otherwise, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our RICMAR, Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research, our RICMAR webinar today. We are going to give it about a minute to allow people to log on to our webinar on behavioral and social research and NIH clinical trial guidance. If you have any questions or comments or concerns before we get started, feel free to send me a chat. We will be asking all of our participants to mute themselves, or we will mute everybody in order to allow our presenters to give their presentation uninterrupted. We'll give it about another minute to get started, and thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for everybody for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in this great country. Welcome to our RICMAR webinar. Our webinar this morning is on the behavioral and social research and NIH clinical trial guidance. Our presenters today are Dr. Partha Bhattcharyya and Dr. Lisa Onken. They will introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentation. My name is Lourdes Guerrero, and I'm the Associate Director for the RICMAR Coordinating Center at UCLA. Again, welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the NIH for their support of our Coordinating Center and for the RICMARs in general. Again, I'd like to thank our presenters this morning for taking time out of their schedules to be with us today. This is information about our RICMAR. Thank you for joining us again. And if you have any questions about our Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research, feel free to reach us on our website or to reach out to us through our emails. Clearly, you have our contact information as you were able to join us today. Please note that we are recording today's webinar, so we ask that all participants mute themselves during the presentation. We also ask that you hold your questions until the end of the presentation, but if you have a pressing concern or issue, I will be monitoring the chat box. So feel free to send me a note in the chat box, and I will ask your question on your behalf if it's pertinent to the conversation. Otherwise, please save your questions until the end when the presenters will answer your questions. At the end of today's seminar, we will be sending you a quick survey to give us feedback on what you have heard today. So please feel free to give us your feedback when you receive it. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over the presentation to our speakers this morning. And again, thank you for joining us. Perfect. We're set to go. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, this is Lisa Onken from the National Institute on Aging. I direct the Behavior Change and Intervention Program at NIA, and I also coordinate the Roybal Translational Centers for NIA. So I'm going to begin this presentation now on behavioral and social research and NIH clinical trial guidance, specifically developed for the RICMAR program. So I want to start off with the definition of a clinical trial, and I should clarify not just the definition, the NIH definition of a clinical trial, because it's very important to notice that NIH has a very specific definition that involves a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related, biomedical, or behavioral outcomes. So if you're trying to determine if your study is a clinical trial, you have to ask yourself a series of questions. The first one being, of course, does the study involve human participants' research? If it involves one or more human subjects, regardless of clinical status, one cohort or new research activity for existing cohorts, then it might be a clinical trial. If the answer is yes, you need to ask yourself another question. Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? Notice it doesn't say randomly assigned. It says prospectively assigned. So you might say, well, my study doesn't involve random assignment, therefore it can't be a clinical trial. Not according to the NIH definition. Similarly, you might say, oh, I only have one participant. It couldn't be a clinical trial. Not according to the NIH definition. You only need one or more human subjects and prospectively assigned to an intervention. The next question you want to ask yourself is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on participants? If the study involves intervention, manipulation, including experimental manipulations to assess functioning under specific conditions or in response to stimuli, track effects of intervention, whether short-term or long-term, and whether effects are variations in normal functioning or clinical changes, then you would answer yes to that question. And the final question you would need to ask is, are you evaluating health-related, biomedical, or behavioral outcomes? Outcome is hypothesized to relate to health, whether proximally or distally. whether as an indicator, mediator, and or moderator of health. An outcome may describe individual, system, or another level of analysis. So on the right, you can see examples of where you might answer no to any one of these questions. So, does the study involve human participant research? Well, if it's a secondary analysis, de-identified data, meta-analysis, the answer would be no. Prospectively assigned to an intervention? Well, if there's a natural experiment in which circumstances are created where there's essentially different interventions, but you're not prospectively assigning anyone. If it's observational research, case control studies, not involving an intervention, then you're not prospectively assigning to an intervention, so the answer would be no. If the study only involves a manipulation that is inherent in assessment, like an fMRI, it's not considered that you're intervening. Or if the outcome is an element of study operations, preference for recruitment materials, feasibility of study procedures, etc., or the outcomes are psychometrics of study measures. You're not evaluating a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome, then the answer would be no. But as you can see, everything on the left, highlighted in green, if you answered yes to all those questions, then your study falls within the definition of an NIH clinical trial. So, as I began to say before about a few characteristics, some characteristics are irrelevant to whether or not a study is classified as a clinical trial. The first one being the number of participants. Unless the number of participants is 0, that's irrelevant. 1 or more is all that you need. So people often say, well, it's a pilot study, so that can't be a clinical trial. That's not the case. Pilot studies are involving 1 or more participants are considered clinical trials. The stage of the trial, if you're doing a stage 1 study, which is generally a pilot study, or a small study, the phase of the study is irrelevant to the question of whether your study is a clinical trial. What about the health status? People say, well, I'm only intervening on healthy participants, so it couldn't be a clinical trial. That's not the case. They could be healthy, they could be at risk, they could be a clinical population. It's all irrelevant to the NIH definition. What about the risk associated with the intervention? Sometimes you hear, well, this is a completely minimal risk intervention. Perhaps it's so minimal risk, it's something like music or asking people to get up and walk at a slow pace. Doesn't matter. It would be a minimal risk intervention, but it wouldn't affect whether it's called a clinical trial. It still could be a clinical trial. The statistical power of the trial doesn't matter. That's basically related to the number of participants. The intended target of the intervention. It doesn't have to be a patient. It could be a provider, a healthcare provider. It could be you're intervening on a community. The setting in which the intervention is delivered doesn't matter. The expected duration of the intervention's effects don't matter. The time from the intervention to assessment of the effects doesn't matter in terms of whether or not your intervention is classified as an NIH clinical trial. Now, some studies meet all of these qualifications, but they're considered basic experimental studies involving humans, which use an intervention to understand fundamental aspects of a phenomenon without specific application toward processes or products in mind. These studies are still subject to NIH stewardship policies, including good clinical practice and the NIH policy on dissemination of clinical trial funded information. I will mention, however, that a notice came out extending whether or not registration is required on clinicaltrials.gov till September 24, 2001. That notice OD 19-126 for BESH studies. So BESH studies must meet two definitions. First, they must qualify according to the NIH definition of a clinical trial, which, as you saw, is a very broad definition, but they also must qualify for the Code of Federal Regulations definition of basic research, which I just mentioned in the previous slide. If you have questions about whether or not your study meets the clinical trial definition, I'm just highlighting that there's a website, a frequently asked questions for that, where you can go and see if your question is there, and hopefully it will help you determine whether or not your study is a clinical trial. So all NIH-funded clinical trials are expected to register and submit results information to clinicaltrials.gov. That is NIH policy. With the exception of BESH studies, which have to report somewhere, but not on clinicaltrials.gov till September 2021. So all clinical trials must have a dissemination plan for their clinical trial. And this language here is basically what you need to say at a minimum. So you're basically ensuring that you're going to register your clinical trial in clinicaltrials.gov. Not only that, you're going to post results information when you have results on clinicaltrials.gov. Your informed consent documents will include a specific statement saying that there will be posting on clinicaltrials.gov of the clinical trial, and your institution has an internal policy in place to ensure that clinical trials registration and results reporting occur in compliance with policy requirements. So basically, your institutional representative will have to send your program officer a statement that indicates, at a minimum, these three things. If you have two things listed but not the third, that is insufficient. It must include all three. Now let's talk a little bit about the NIH policy for data and safety monitoring. The NIH policy for data and safety monitoring states that all NIH-funded clinical trials require a data and safety monitoring plan, and that monitoring should be commensurate with risk. You should take note that the National Institute on Aging website has guidance on clinical trials, and you should carefully follow that guidance and make sure it's reflected in all of your data and safety monitoring plans submitted. So this is a checklist that some program officers send out to grantees to make sure that they've completed all of the requirements for when they propose a clinical trial. I'm not going to go through each one separately here in detail, but just to say that you will need to have a data safety monitoring plan, as mentioned, that has to be in complete compliance with NIA guidance on clinical trials, and the NIH policy for data and safety monitoring, and another notice called Further Guidance on Data and Safety Monitoring for Phase 1 and Phase 2 trials, if your trial is a Phase 1 or Phase 2 trial, and the NIH guidance on reporting adverse events to institutional review boards for multi-site center trials. These are all live links, so if you have the slides from this presentation, you can access this through the slides. Some studies require a data and safety monitoring board. Such studies could be multi-site studies, often require data and safety monitoring boards. If there are particularly high-risk interventions or vulnerable populations, your study may require a data and safety monitoring board. If such a board is required, additional materials are also required as indicated. I mentioned clinical Trials.gov registration and clinical trial dissemination plan already. And I briefly mentioned good clinical practice training that basically anyone involved with a clinical trial at your site needs to have completed and updated every 3 years, I believe. So getting back to the issue of data and safety monitoring board, the NIH requires data and safety monitoring generally in the forms of DSMBs for phase 3 or stage 4 clinical trials. So you might ask, well, what's a phase 3 clinical trial? According to the Code of Federal Regulations, phase 3 studies are expanded, controlled, and uncontrolled trials. And phase 3 studies usually involve several hundred to several thousand subjects. I should mention this is the Code of Federal Regulations Subpart B, which involves investigational new drugs. And you might say, well, I'm not investigating a new drug. So since definitions of phases involve drugs, biologics, or devices, there is another way of classifying where you are in the intervention development process, and that is with stages. And the size of a phase 3 drug is most similar to the size of a stage 4 behavioral intervention trial. So what's a stage 4 trial? Well, stage 4 is one of the stages of the NIH Stage Model. And stage 4 studies are research studies that test the effectiveness of evidence-based behavioral interventions in community settings. Stage 4 clinical trials seek to maximize external validity. So, getting back to what is the NIH Stage Model, the NIH Stage Model is a conceptual framework designed specifically for the development of behavioral interventions as opposed to drugs, biologics, or devices. If you want a more detailed description of the stage model, you can go to the video that is located on the National Institute on Aging Behavioral and Social Sciences research site, and the video is located there. When we say behavioral, we're using that in the broadest sense, and it includes behavioral, cognitive, affective, social, interpersonal, societal, organizational interventions. So the goal of the NIH Stage Model is to develop principle-driven interventions that are maximally implementable and maximally efficacious. So as I said, the goal is to develop principle-driven interventions. So principles and mechanisms of behavior change of an intervention are a major focus of that intervention, of that model. It's a very non-prescriptive model. Basically, it identifies where you are in the intervention process. It doesn't dictate how you should get to the next stage, and for that matter, in some ways it's less prescriptive than other models because it's multi-directional and non-linear. It doesn't always make sense to go from stage 1, for example, to stage 2. Sometimes it makes sense to go back to stage 1. Sometimes with certain types of interventions that don't require, that are very, very simple, that are very, very easy to administer, and sometimes it's possible to go from stage 1 directly to stage 4, for example. It depends on the results you have, it depends on the type of intervention, etc. But it's a multi-directional, non-linear, iterative recursive model that addresses the full range of translational intervention development, from basic research all the way through dissemination and implementation and back. So, getting back to the statement about the stage model emphasizing principles, let's take this example so I can give you an example of identifying principles and the potential value. So let's say you have interventions A through Q. You might ask yourself, are some of these interventions operating under the same principle? Let's say it's principle yellow. And we find that actually some of them are operating under the same principle. They might have different characteristics. I put in the Dr. Seuss characteristics. A yellow intervention delivered in a box, yellow with a fox, with a cat, with a hat, yellow with finger snapping, yellow with lots of tapping. Sometimes there's a lot of bells and whistles to interventions, but they're still operating under the same basic principles. And other interventions might be operating under other principles, say principle pink versus principle green. And if it turns out that you can identify those principles, you may find that you really have 3 basic interventions as opposed to the large number that you thought you had. So you bring parsimony to the field. So the reason this is brought up is because there are questions that you can ask yourself when you're creating or adapting an intervention in a clinical trial. The first 2 obvious ones are, is there an important public health problem that needs to be addressed? And the second one is there a group of people who have this problem? But that's not where you stop. You might ask yourself, is there an existing intervention for this problem that already shows efficacy? And if so, are the principles underlying the intervention known? Has the intervention been tested with this population? And if it hasn't been tested, why wouldn't testing the existing intervention be the next step? If this intervention works with this population, if it has been tested, then why is a new one needed? What will the proposed intervention do that the original intervention didn't do? What's the case that can be made based on research showing that it is necessary to create a new intervention? If the intervention doesn't work with this population, what's your hypothesis regarding why not? Why wouldn't the same principles apply? What is or are your hypothesized principles of the proposed intervention? Will the proposed intervention have relevance to other populations? Will the hypothesized principles, and hence the proposed new intervention, be applicable to other groups that have similar characteristics? So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Bhattcharyya.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So my name is Partha Bhattcharyya. I'm a health economist / behavioral economist by training. I direct our Impact Collaboratory to improve care for people with dementia and their caregivers. So what I will go over at this point are, some of the details Lisa went over that you may need when you're submitting an application, or what your program officer may look for. So we'll transition to the point is, Lisa went over, well, when you write an application, you need a DSMB. She went over a couple of items that the DSMB needs, that you may need for a DSMB. So you ask yourself, does my clinical trial really need a DSMB? So NIH in general requires data safety monitoring in forms of DSMB for phase 3 clinical trial or stage 4 clinical trials. For phase 1 and phase 2, these are the earlier stages, DSMB may be appropriate if the study has multiple clinical sites, right? Why it may be appropriate if you have multiple clinical sites? The reason is the data flow that comes in may be complicated. You may be dealing with blinded sites or masked sites, or across the whole trial may be masked, right? Or employ particularly high-risk intervention groups. Imagine you're intervening on a group of dementia patients, right? Or it may involve vulnerable populations. Again, it can be a high-risk population with a high-risk disease, such as cancer, you know, or they may have cognitive impairment, right? How do you consent them for such a trial, right? So these are the risks you know, you have to worry about. And these are a handful, and we're not discussing all the details. You may want to refer to the guidance that NIH set forward. This was set forward by NIH OD in 2000 and is still applicable to this state. Vulnerable population. Let's get into that because we are National Institute on Aging and we're dealing with older Americans. And risk may vary depending on the particular groups they belong to and depending on the nature and research being conducted. So not all trials are equal, right? That's the finer point. So when you intervene, let's say on a decision-making, in the decision-making context, let's say you have a trial and you intervene on an 18-year-old, let's say you ask them about advanced care directive, it may have different implications compared to those that are in their 70s. I'm saying 70s specifically, not 65, because they're nearing, you know, they're thinking about death as a prospect, and that may lead them to make certain choices about, let's say, advanced care directive in a completely different way than someone who is 18-year-old. We have to make sure we're not inducing them to, you know, to make certain kinds of decisions, and that's what a DSMB can partake in and can advise you on. In addition, groups that are specified already in 45 CFR 46, and these are pregnant women, human fetuses, neonates, prisoners, and children, we are particularly sensitive about and usually requires DSMB. That's the default. It will have DSMBs. Consider what protections or additional steps you may need to minimize risk for your study population, such as outlining procedures for consenting individuals with diminished decision-making capacity. And this may require, you know, getting someone from the family to work with you and get additional consent. And again, these are not easy study designs to implement, and you have to think through these on how to do that, because at the end of the day, it is imperative that we protect the participants of an intervention. Next, you know, research which involving individuals with questionable capacity to consent. Again, I hit on some of these, involving someone who is dependent on the study that is unaffiliated with a clinician to serve as a monitor of the consent process or entire study may be appropriate for some studies. Again, you don't necessarily need a DSMB. Maybe you can have a safety officer. And that's something that you may want to think about as you're designing the study, as you're writing about it, as you're writing about the data safety monitoring plan. And when you ask yourself, do I need a data safety monitoring board, you want to ask yourself this question, you know, can we have a study monitor who can be the judge, you know, so that we're not biasing the whole study, right? A monitor can be appointed to be present when investigators invite individuals with impaired consent capacity to participate in research studies. When reviewing research involving individuals with impaired consent capacity, IRBs can explore the value of an independent monitor. This is an important concept, right? The IRB can weigh in and say, no, you really need a data safety monitoring board. Or the IRB can say you need an independent monitor and a DSMB, depending on how they view the risk of the study. An IRB can decide to observe aspects of the study process itself, such as recruitment, consent capacity, informed consent, debriefing of research subjects and their families as well. Sorry, one point to hit on here is legally authorized representatives. If you're dealing with individuals, especially older Americans with questionable capacity consent, you know, you really need to think about legally authorized representatives and go through the consent process. It's just not getting their caregiver who may be with them and getting them to say yes, right? It can be LPN that takes care of them during the day. That's not what you're looking for in that instance. You really need to get hold of that family member or whoever the legally authorized representative may be. So let's quickly now go over, the list of stuff of what will a reviewer and a program officer look for when they review your grant. In the case of program officer, sometimes they're asked before making a funding decision, is this okay grant to fund, or after, right? Human subject protection plan. This is an important element, and you should really spend some time thinking and writing about human subjects protection and how you're going to protect people that will participate in your study. Reviewers look for it, and if they, if they do not like your human subjects protection plan, they can say this plan is not good. We call it in our language Code 48. That means human subject protection plans are not acceptable. If a plan is not acceptable, the outcome of that is it depends on the PO and the institution to put in a correct human subject protection plan, which is often written by the PIs. Single IRB plan. Now, NIH instituted a single IRB policy, and this is applicable for any clinical trial you're working on that deals with multi-sites or multiple institutions. You need to present a single IRB plan which states, one institution is in charge of the IRB and the others will literally defer to that single IRB review or carry out. There needs to be a dialogue, and the process needs to be written out in form of a single IRB process. So pay attention to that. Lisa went over that. Again, this is an important element, and we are seeing many applications missing this simple element of single IRB. It's often missed, so consider that. Inclusion monitoring. Inclusion monitoring happens to be an important element. When you're designing the study, how large should the N be? As you're doing your power calculation, make sure your inclusion tables, your human subjects protection plan, and the tables actually reflect the correct numbers for your recruitment. Often we see these tables as missing. Or if it's a dyadic intervention, that means you're intervening not only on the persons with dementia, but let's say you're intervening also on the caregivers, you should have, you design literally two interventions in those cases. So you should separate the inclusion tables. Data and safety monitoring plan. Data safety monitoring plan is an important element. Notice the two words that are in there. Is data, how are you going to get the data, process the data, that part, and safety of your participants. It's an important plan, and there's a lot you can find on NIH website. The point here is not to go over the details of it, but to highlight you need to have that, and sometimes reviewers look into it. And if they find flaws in it, they will pick it out. Lastly, your program officer will look for that, right, before they sign off on a grant. It's a required element. We cannot release grants without data safety monitoring plans. So it is very important that you put a solid plan in place, and there are a lot of primers, so kindly go over those primers. But if you have taken some of the trainings, it will cover data and safety monitoring plans and how to devise them. Data and Safety Monitoring Board. Again, this is just a heads up. You don't need a Data Safety Monitoring Board charter when you're submitting the grant. It can be determined after in conjunction with a program officer. But this is something that you want to consider if you have vulnerable population, if you are conducting large trials such as pragmatic trials, stage 3 trials that often take place across multiple institutions, right? Clinical trial dissemination plan. Lisa again went over this in detail. This is just a primer to tell you, remember to put that in. If it's not there, we are not able to release a grant, right? Reviewers may be looking for it, and this basically gets at register the trial, make sure they're consented so that you can release some of the data, right? Data and resource sharing plan, they're becoming very important. It's data and resource. Note those two words. Data is the data that you're collecting. Think about how you're going to de-identify clinical trials data, right? And resources are generally, from trial protocol to, let's say someone wants to replicate your trial. How will they replicate it if they do not have the protocol? They cannot, right? So think about resources that you will generate as part of your trial and how you make them available. Often for pragmatic trials, it's the process, right? I run many of my trials. They involve, prompts for EHR, electronic health records. And PIs have to share those resources because if they do not share, no one else can take them up and replicate it. It's an important component of replication. So data, resource is everything else that you can think of that is associated with the trial, and you should consider sharing them. We understand some of the data that you collect may not be shareable. That's fine. Put a plan in place on how they can access such data, right? For example, I'll give you one that I can think of readily. CMS claims data that can potentially be used as outcomes for a pragmatic trial cannot be shared. But guess what you can have? You can have a plan in place that says how someone can access the data after they get approval from Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services. Plans are important. So these are all the components we went over. Again, some of them are required. You should consider putting in one item that is not required, but again, you should consider and provide some thoughts. Happens to be the Data Safety Monitoring Board and thinking about that. But remainder of the items are pretty much required nowadays. So much has changed in NIH clinical trial process, and this is a slide from our colleagues at NIH CT. I hope this primer that Lisa and I am providing today gives you some of the basic changes that has happened, and that is a lot in short. So idea that good clinical practice training is required. January 1st of 2017. Applications, as you're going through the stages, clinical trial specific funding opportunity were announced. Again, they're required. Starting January 25th, 2018. Remember the note Lisa made about BESH trials. They require registration too, either in the Trials.gov system or in a different system starting 2021. And then IRB review. Single IRB policy was implemented in January 25th, 2018. That means if you submitted an application after that date, you're affected. So if you're hearing this and you're planning to submit an application, make a note of that and please put a single IRB plan in place, because that is one thing we can avoid going over with you at the time of release of the grant. FDA review, again, it may be required for some grants, certain grants. If you're designing grants with technology or interventions with technology, that is a moving arena that FDA is developing guidance for. And I can't even keep up with it, and I'm in the mix of things, and keep an eye out on things, and our requests may change as time comes. Enrollment and data collection. Remember, expanded clinicaltrials.gov registration and results submission policy was implemented in 2017, but much of the capture that we are doing on clinical trials outcome, that has changed on the health, our human subjects tracking system. You are required to put clinical trials outcomes at this point. You're required to put some of those outcomes in clinicaltrials.gov. So I think this summarizes the whole chain of the clinical trial process, and we will end at this time, and we will open it up to questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Let's go ahead and open up the lines for our participants. Do any of the attendees have a question? If so, feel free to ask your question in the chat. Somebody has raised their hand. Can we unmute them, please?
We cannot see any of the questions, so you have to bear with us because...
Correct, it's me. I've got control. T, can we open up the line for the folks that have raised their hands? I see Jen has a question. Jen, maybe if you can ask it in the chat. What is the difference between principles and mechanisms? Can you give me an example of a principle versus a mechanism?
We're kind of using principle and mechanism to mean the same thing. A mechanism is like if you ask the question, what is causing this intervention, and you target what you believe is causing the intervention, that would be a target that would be involved in a mechanism of behavior change. If you understand what the process is, or the basic principle that is causing something to happen, that's a principle. So you wouldn't be able to derive a principle without understanding what the mechanism of action of the intervention is.
Any other questions, or that was it?
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Nobody else has raised their hands. Are there any other questions? Perhaps any questions specific to our social or behavioral science studies?
So if we have more people on, we can go over some of the case studies if you guys like. We have additional deck for that, and we just prepared that just in case if there is an interest.
Sure. Since this webinar is being recorded, maybe it would be good for you all to show us perhaps an example or a case study of a study. It could serve as a guidance for the rest of us. That would be great.
Okay, hold on. Let us do our magic. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. These are clinical trials case studies, and many of them are listed on our website. These case studies apply the following, 4 questions to determine whether NIH should consider research studies to be a clinical trial. Does the study involve human participants? That's one. Remember, Lisa went through that workflow. We just want to come back and, realign you with that. Are there participants prospectively? This word is often missed. It's not random. It's not anything else. It's prospectively assigned to an intervention, right? Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of intervention on participants, right? Look at this word, evaluate the effect. It's the effectiveness that you're studying, right? Is the effect being evaluated a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome, all right? If the answer to all these 4 questions are yes, then we agree that these are clinical trial studies, right? We'll start with that primer. Again, this is going over. Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa now, who will go over the specific case study.
We'll alternate.
Yeah.
So the first one is actually a very interesting one because the study involves the recruitment of healthy volunteers to test a new behavioral intervention. That sounds to me like a clinical trial already. But it's designed to evaluate the acceptability of the intervention. The outcome is acceptability, not efficacy. So you would ask yourself the following questions. Does it involve human participants? Yes, the study involves human participants. You can say, sounds like a clinical trial so far. Are the patients prospectively assigned to an intervention? The answer is yes, sounds like a clinical trial so far. Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants? Well, it's not designed to evaluate the effect of the behavioral intervention on the participants. It's only designed to assess user acceptability. So this one actually turns out not to qualify as a clinical trial. So if you're just looking at feasibility and acceptability, and even if you're prospectively assigning participants to interventions and it meets all the other qualifications, it's not a clinical trial. And it's really important to get this right because we mentioned earlier that there are clinical trial specific FOAs, and if you apply, you know, in the RICMAR Center, if you're applying as a pilot, it's not quite as problematic. But if you're going outside the RICMAR and applying for an NIH grant, and you use a program announcement or an RFA that says clinical trial required, your application will be sent back without review if you're not proposing a clinical trial.
Yeah, okay. So, you know, this is case number 9. Again, you'll see what we did is if you click here, you can actually go over to the case study side. There are many, and we just selected a handful. And this study involves recruitment of healthy volunteers who will be randomized to different durations of sleep deprivation, including no sleep deprivation as a control, and who have stress and hormone levels measured. It is designed to determine whether the levels of stress hormone in blood rise in response to different durations of sleep deprivation. Right? So again, we all agree, well, the study involves human subjects participation. Again, in healthy volunteers, that's what they are. Are the study participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? The answer is yes, randomly assigned. That's the word they use in this case. Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on participants? The answer is yes. The study is designed to measure the effect of different sleep durations of sleep deprivation on stress hormone levels. Given that the study uses an intervention to study understanding fundamental aspects of phenomena without specific application towards a process or products in mind, this study can fall within, of the BESH studies FOA design. Again, we're just giving you a heads up. This is, if you have studies like this, it can come into the BESH funding opportunity announcement or in the clinical trial 1. It's fine to come into both, but this is just giving you an indicator that it can come into both. Is this effect being evaluated on a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? Again, here the answer is yes. The effect being evaluated happens to be stress hormone levels. I think we all agree here is a health-related biomedical outcome. This is an example of a basic experimental study using humans, and again, this will fall under clinical trial study as per NIH definition. So next case, Lisa, I'll turn it over.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Bhattcharyya. I'd like to just interrupt you really quickly. We do have 2 questions in the chat that I'd like to bring up that are regarding the 2 cases that you brought up.
Okay.
The first question is specific to case number 9 and how you would differentiate different experimental conditions versus an intervention.
Goes back to the definition of basic experimental research, which was in an earlier slide. We gave a link to the definition of that.
You can also go over here to find more, right here. See here for more information for BESH, specifically BESH. What was the second question?
Sure, thanks. The second question, if you have any suggestions or information on where to include in the research strategy versus forms related to clinical trials. The question is, where can we look for information on which information to include in the research strategy versus forms related to clinical trials? The comment is, I have seen summary statements where reviewers cannot find information, but the information was there, just in a different section of the grant.
Yeah, this is, then you get at how someone should write an application. That's what you're getting at. And the strategy varies wildly. It can potentially be in the approach section, right? You can write about how you're designing an experiment. So it becomes tricky, I will say, and is very dependent on the person who is writing. I don't have the secret sauce of what would be the right place in in those 12 pages that you have to put this.
Great, thanks. Another question is whether or not you would consider this a clinical trial. Examining the effect of caregiver training during inpatient rehabilitation after stroke on functional recovery of hospital readmission. So the intervention is a caregiver training intervention. Would you consider this a clinical trial?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
And that's the dyadic type that we talked about, right? So what you need to do in that case, you actually need to track two sets of individuals, the dyads, the caregivers, and the stroke victims as well.
Well, also, it's an intervention for training
providers.
So it's actually three.
Yeah.
Three. But, you know, earlier we said the irrelevant characteristics, one of them was who you're intervening on, and it could be on the provider.
I hope that answered your question. Thanks. Another question has come up on the chat. Is it appropriate to replicate human subjects' text or inclusion criteria in both the body of the grant and in the human subjects form?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Is it appropriate to replicate the human subjects' text or the inclusion criteria in both the body of the grant as well as the human subject forms?
So the human subject form is a separate page you get where you human subjects protection plan. You get to write a little more about it. Remember, you have 12 pages to write the actual application, right? Or 6 pages if you're submitting an R21, right? Strategize. You can't just repeat the same. You have a subset of the text in the actual application, but you cannot have the full plan laid out as part of the regular application.
Great, thank you. Another question has come in about NIA priority areas. Are there any priority areas being emphasized by the NIA at this point?
Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's disease, you know, we have been very fortunate, you know, with appropriations in that area, and we will welcome applications, you know.
But also, generally speaking, the way we advertise our priorities is through FOAs, program announcements, and RFAs. You can get a heads up on what's going to be coming down the pike, because after we present concepts for FOAs to our council, our National Advisory Council, within usually a week or so, those concepts are posted on our webpage. So you can get an idea about FOAs that are coming. But we are not permitted to give specifics other than what is posted. You know, the specifics will come when the announcement is posted. But one common misperception is, you know, I hear this all the time, well, you had an RFA on this last year, but I didn't see an RFA this year, so I'm assuming you're not interested anymore. That's exactly the wrong assumption to make. We have RFAs to jumpstart a field because there's, you know, a huge amount of interest in it, and there's so many important areas. We can't have, you know, repeat RFAs of the same areas every year. But if we had one last year, there's a good chance we're still interested in it this year, and you can apply not to that RFA anymore because it's expired, but you can, you know, use a parent R01 or R21 or the appropriate activity code, and generally you can find out if we're really still interested in it by calling a program officer who handles that area. Often a good way to figure that out might be to look at the name on the RFA for the scientific contact and say, are you still interested in this area? So there's lots of ways to figure out what we're interested in but they're mostly through published notices.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them there, and I will make sure to ask our presenters about that. We have 2 minutes left in our webinar today. I'm not sure if there are any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with us, as I'm not sure we have enough time to go through another case study.
No, we actually do not have. Lisa and I were just looking at each other, and we actually do not have. It takes time, and again, it will lead to more questions, you know. So
Well,
we're happy to answer questions, but
I would just say as a final thought, just there's a lot of policies, there's a lot of guidance. It's difficult to wade through. We have templates here at NIA that try to make it easy for people to follow, but it's just important to follow it carefully because it can really expedite, you know, your approval to go forward with your clinical trial if you've done things right. And the other thing is to be really careful about how you're defining your study as a clinical trial or not, because it hurts if you're going to be, especially writing a grant application for something that says clinical trial required or clinical trial not allowed, and you've gotten it wrong, and you've spent a lot of time only to have your application not be appropriate for that FOA. So that's in conclusion.
Thank you so much. I have two final questions. The first one is about the definition of the clinical trial again. This one is, if the case includes dementia patients and their caregivers for outcome measures, but the intervention was not directly involving the caregivers, only the dementia patients, is that considered a clinical trial, including the dyad?
Yes, if you're intervening on the dementia patient, then it should be it doesn't matter if you're intervening on the patient or the caregiver or the provider for that matter.
it's the outcomes at the end of the day, behavioral outcomes and health outcomes.
Right. I mean, unless you're just assessing feasibility and acceptability, as we discussed before, but if you're looking at a health-related outcome and it meets all of those other requirements, yes.
The key word here is effectiveness. If you are trying to study an effectiveness of an intervention, right, it will be a clinical trial.
Right, which gets confusing when there's only one person, because you say, how do you study effect, but you're still looking at the effects of something on that person and getting a health-related outcome. That doesn't sound like my definition I learned years ago of a clinical trial, but it is the NIH definition, one or more people looking at the health outcome prospectively assigned. Yep.
Last two more questions. One is, so the BESH studies are considered clinical trials?
They meet the requirements. Yeah, they meet all those. If you look at the definition of an NIH clinical trial, they actually fall into that definition. Yep. Perfect.
And the last question is regarding the presentation. And so, yes, the webinar today was recorded, and we will be posting it on the RICMAR Coordinating Center website. In terms of the slides, will you all be sharing your slides with us, and so we can post them along with the webinar?
Yeah, we'll put a regular disclosure we are required to put right up in the front, because we express certain opinions. You know, during the discussion, we are required to give a disclosure. We'll add that disclosure, and then we'll send it your way.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you again for your participation. We will be sending out a brief survey, and we ask that all of you respond to that survey so that we can ensure to provide appropriate and relevant webinars to our participants. So thank you again. Thank you to our presenters for being with us. Have a great day.
Thank you for helping us. Bye-bye.
So Partha and Lisa, I don't know if you guys can still hear me. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I really appreciate your willingness to share your information with us. I really look forward to posting this. We definitely had more people registered for the webinar than we did on the call today, but it's likely that the information is very relevant to them, so they want to make sure that they have access to the information after the fact. So I look forward to receiving your slides and to speaking to you soon. Thank you so much.